August 13th, 1943. Over the gray skies of Hanover, Germany, 10 men are trapped inside a burning fortress of metal. Flames lick through torn aluminum. Oil seeps across the floor, black and boiling. The bomber's engines cough like dying beasts. At 20,000 feet, the air is thin, freezing, and full of death. The plane is a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, call sign Ruthie II. She was supposed to return to England hours ago. Now she is bleeding smoke, shuddering, barely holding together, and at her controls sits a man who refuses to leave. His name is Lieutenant John C. Red Morgan. He has a choice: jump and live, or stay and die with the plane. But in that moment, with one engine dead, another on fire, and his co-pilot unconscious beside him, John Morgan does something almost no one in his position would ever do. He holds the controls. He keeps flying. Alone. The crew behind him screams through the intercom, "We're hit! Bail out!" But he does not answer. His oxygen mask is cracked. Blood drips into his eyes. The stick shakes violently in his hands, the bomber rolling on one wing, threatening to flip. Still, he grips tighter. He looks at the empty sky ahead and keeps flying into it, because in that moment, his hands are the only thing keeping 10 men alive. The sky over Germany that day was not a sky of blue. It was a killing ground. Hundreds of B-17s from the 8th Air Force had crossed the North Sea at dawn, bound for the heart of the Reich. Their target, the Messerschmitt aircraft factories of Regensburg and Schweinfurt, the beating heart of Germany's war machine. It was one of the most dangerous missions of the entire air campaign. And for young men like Morgan, each flight was a coin toss between life and oblivion. At 26, Morgan was no stranger to risk. He had been a cowboy, a ranch hand, a student of medicine, and a wanderer. He had lived in Wyoming's wild plains before the war pulled him into the sky. But nothing, not even the open range, could prepare him for the chaos that erupted above Europe that morning. The mission began cleanly. The formations climbed in neat boxes, silver birds glinting in the sun, engines roaring in harmony. The horizon seemed endless. But as the bombers reached enemy airspace, the sky darkened with contrails and cannon smoke. From below rose the black flowers of flak bursts, German anti-aircraft shells exploding in invisible hands. Each burst shook the air like thunder. Shrapnel clanged against fuselages. Oxygen masks frosted with fear. And from the east came the fighters, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, slicing through the clouds like knives. Their guns spat fire and tracers in long, merciless arcs. Inside Ruthie II, the intercom crackled. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high!" Machine gun turrets swung. Spent shells rained through the narrow aisles. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the cabin. Then, impact. A 20mm shell smashed through the cockpit. The co-pilot was hit instantly, his skull fractured, blood spraying across the control panel. The shock slammed into Morgan's shoulder, twisting the yoke from his hands. The bomber lurched, instruments shattered, the windshield webbed with cracks. In seconds, the Ruthie II was spiraling, rolling violently toward the earth. For any other man, that would have been the end. Standard orders were clear. If the plane is out of control, the crew bails. But Morgan, bleeding, half-conscious, reached for the controls again. He could feel the muscles in his neck scream from the G-forces. His injured co-pilot, delirious and thrashing, grabbed the controls and fought against him, pulling in the opposite direction, sending the plane veering wildly. It was chaos in the cockpit. 2 men locked in a deadly struggle, one conscious, one half-mad, the fate of 10 souls between them. Morgan could have let go. He could have parachuted out, left the crippled plane to crash. No one would have blamed him. But something in him refused. Through the smoke and noise, through the blur of pain, a thought took hold. If I leave, they die. So he stayed. And as the bomber screamed over the clouds of Germany, John Morgan, alone, wounded, and trapped, began one of the most extraordinary flights in the history of war. The year is 1943. Europe is burning. The Allies have turned the tide, but victory is still distant and costly. Every dawn, the skies over occupied Europe thunder with the engines of the 8th Air Force. Young men flying silver bombers into a continent swallowed by smoke. They are barely out of their teens, most with faces too young to belong to death. Yet each morning, they climb aboard their aircraft, knowing that the odds are not in their favor. In those days, the numbers spoke for themselves, and they spoke with cruelty. A B-17 crew had to complete 25 missions to return home. Few ever did. On average, 1 in 5 bombers would not make it back from a single sortie. The rest often limped home, engines shot out, wings riddled with holes, fuselage shredded like paper. When they landed, there were often empty seats that would never be filled again. They called their aircraft flying fortresses, a name meant to inspire confidence, to make these young men believe they were untouchable. But everyone in the air knew the truth. There was no fortress in the sky. High above the channel, the cold was merciless. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and frost crept into every breath. The bombers formed tight boxes, disciplined, mechanical, their silver skins glinting under the pale sun. Below them, France stretched out in silence, its towns occupied, its roads filled with enemy convoys. But beyond that silence, waiting in the clouds, were the Luftwaffe. They came fast, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slicing through the sunlight like wolves among sheep. Their guns spoke only once, but each burst could tear a bomber apart. For every hour in the air, the crews lived a lifetime. They watched smoke trails spiral from the sky, sometimes a parachute blossoming beneath it, sometimes not. They could do nothing but fly straight, steady, predictable, exposed, while enemy fire stitched across the formation. To the men of the 8th Air Force, England was both refuge and prison. Every base was the same: muddy runways, corrugated huts, the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. Before takeoff, the chaplain would say a few words. The men would joke, smoke, write a last letter. Some carried tokens, a photograph, a medal, a lock of hair. Others carried nothing. When the mission briefings began, the room would fall silent. A map. Red lines stretching deep into enemy territory. The target circled in chalk. Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, or some nameless rail yard in the heart of Germany. Each line on that map meant another day stolen from luck. And yet, they still went. Every time, they were told their missions mattered, that each factory destroyed, each bridge collapsed, would shorten the war. Maybe it did. But for the men who flew, it was simpler. They flew because their crew depended on them, because the man next to them had a family too, because to give up meant leaving others to die alone. It was in this world of steel, smoke, and frost that Lieutenant John C. Morgan found himself. A quiet man from Texas, 27 years old, older than most of his crew. Before the war, he had worked in the oil fields and, for a time, as a cowboy. He had wanted to fly since boyhood, but war gave him the chance in the harshest way possible. He wasn't famous, not yet. Just another face in the long line of pilots standing in briefing rooms, eyes fixed on the map, heart pounding at the thought of what waited above Europe. His aircraft was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, heavy, powerful, and unforgiving. Its name, Ruthie II. Morgan was assigned as co-pilot, sharing control with another officer, Lieutenant Robert Campbell. They had never flown together before that morning. In the rush of war, men met their fates beside strangers. The mission, to bomb the industrial facilities at Hanover, Germany. A routine run, they were told. But in war, routine is the most dangerous word. July 28, 1943. Dawn breaks over the English countryside. Engines roar to life, one by one, shaking the damp air. Mechanics wave them off, their faces half hidden behind scarves. Morgan sits in the cockpit, headset on, gloved hands resting on the controls. Ahead, The runway glows faintly in the morning mist. He can hear the deep, rhythmic thrum of 4 Wright Cyclone engines. It's a sound that comforts him and terrifies him. Once those engines take flight, fate becomes a coin toss. Inside the fuselage, his crew checks their stations. Gunners, navigator, bombardier, each man silent, focused. They all know the odds. They just don't talk about them. The B-17 begins to roll. Wheels lift. The earth falls away. Below them, England shrinks into a patchwork of fields and fog. Ahead, the clouds of Europe. And beyond them, the storm. That morning, among hundreds of aircraft rising into the dawn, no one could have known that one of them, Ruthie II, would become a legend. That its co-pilot would face a choice no man should ever face. And that his decision, made in the silence between life and death, would save 9 other souls. The war was vast. The mission, routine. But in the heart of that cold sky, history was waiting. At 8:30 that morning, Ruthie II crossed the coast of France. Below, the fields looked calm, a lie painted by distance. Above, the contrails of hundreds of bombers tangled like white scars across the sky. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant John C. Morgan adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced at his instruments. Everything was steady. Altitude, 25,000 feet. Airspeed, 165 knots. Formation tight. To his right sat Lieutenant Robert Campbell, the aircraft commander. He was younger than Morgan, wiry, sharp-eyed, known among the crew for his precision. Together they made a good team, disciplined, professional, and calm under pressure. Or at least, that's how the day began. Morgan's hands rested lightly on the yoke. Outside, the vast formation moved in perfect order, each plane spaced just right, each one trusting the others not to falter. To maintain that formation was life itself. Fall behind, and you were alone, a slow-moving target for the waiting German fighters. The radio crackled. A low, tense voice came through. "Bandits! 9 o'clock high!" Then the world erupted. From above and behind, dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove through the formation. Their guns flashed. The sky filled with the roar of engines and the metallic rattle of gunfire. Morgan could feel the vibrations through his seat. Tracers sliced past the cockpit like burning needles. In the distance, a bomber burst into flames, a brief, blinding orange before it disintegrated in mid-air. Parachutes blossomed below, drifting into the void. Campbell shouted orders over the intercom. "Gunners, stay sharp! Navigator, keep her on course!" Then, a jolt. A burst of cannon fire tore through the nose of the plane. The cockpit shook violently. Glass shattered. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid filled the air. Morgan turned and froze. A shell had exploded through the side of the cockpit. Campbell was hit. The co-pilot could see blood streaking across the instrument panel. Campbell slumped forward, half-conscious, one hand still gripping the controls. For a moment, the aircraft began to roll dangerously to the right. Morgan grabbed the yoke with both hands, trying to correct it. "Hang on!" he shouted, voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "I've got it." But Campbell, delirious, in shock, fought him. His body, driven by reflex or madness, tried to pull the controls in the opposite direction. The bomber shuddered again, nose dipping, wings groaning under the strain. For the next few seconds, chaos ruled the cockpit. Campbell, bleeding heavily, screamed incoherently, clawing at the controls. His oxygen mask had been ripped away by the blast. His mind was drowning in hypoxia and pain. He turned toward Morgan, eyes wide, unfocused, and began to attack him. A fist struck Morgan's shoulder, then his face. Morgan tried to push him back, but the pilot's harness kept Campbell locked in his seat. "Let go, damn it!" Morgan shouted. But Campbell didn't hear, or couldn't. He reached for the control column again, pulling hard. The B-17 rolled violently. In the rear, crewmen shouted as loose ammunition boxes slid across the floor. If Morgan lost control, the entire aircraft, and all 10 souls aboard would spiral into the ground. In that moment, John Morgan's war changed. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was fighting for control against his own commander, against the chaos inside a shattered cockpit, against the cold logic of death. He tried to call the navigator. No response. The intercom line was dead. The blast had severed the oxygen system for the front compartment. Frost was forming on the edges of the broken window. The wind screamed through the hole where the glass had been. Morgan realized something terrible. He couldn't leave the controls. Not for a second. With his right hand, he held the yoke. With his left, he gripped Campbell's arm, trying to keep him from pulling again. Campbell thrashed, blood pouring from a head wound, shouting incoherently about enemy fighters and pulling up. Every few seconds, Morgan felt the muscles in Campbell's arm tense, and he'd have to fight to keep the plane level. Behind them, the battle raged. Machine guns rattled in the waist section. The gunners were firing non-stop, their tracers vanishing into the white sky. Over the intercom, fragments of speech cut through the static. Tail gunners out. Right engine smoking. Navigator hit! The formation had started to break. Some aircraft were already turning back, but Ruthie II couldn't. Morgan couldn't even reach the throttle to reduce power. His left arm was trapped holding Campbell in place, his right arm straining against the yoke. His headset crackled, orders coming in, radio chatter, mayday calls. He ignored them all. All that existed now was the cockpit, the screaming wind, the smell of blood and oil, the weight of another man trying to kill them both. Minutes passed, then half an hour, then more. The air was freezing. Morgan's arm went numb. The vibration of the engines blurred the world into noise, but somehow the plane stayed in formation. He could see the other B-17s to his left and right, steady, disciplined, unaware of the chaos inside Ruthie II. From the outside, she looked fine, a bomber still flying its course. Only Morgan knew the truth, that every second was a battle. He thought of trying to knock Campbell unconscious, but one mistake could throw the plane into a spin. He couldn't risk it, so he held on, one hand on life, one on death. Hours later, Ruthie II turned toward home. The mission was complete. Bombs dropped. The survivors headed back to England, but Morgan's ordeal was far from over. The aircraft was crippled, its oxygen system destroyed, engines damaged. And in the seat beside him, Campbell, delirious, bleeding, still fought every time Morgan eased the controls. Every time he thought of letting go, he looked behind him, at the men who depended on him. The gunners, the navigator, the radio operator, all waiting for someone to bring them home. And so he stayed. For 2 hours, John Morgan flew the Ruthie II with one hand, fighting off his own pilot with the other. The sky over Germany was a graveyard of vapor trails. What had begun as formation precision had now dissolved into scattered fragments. Bombers limping westward, some smoking, some missing wings, some already tumbling toward the black earth below. But through that chaos, one aircraft held steady, Ruthie II. From the outside, she looked like a survivor. From within, she was on the edge of collapse. Lieutenant John C. Morgan had been fighting for control for more than 2 hours. One arm on the yoke, one arm restraining his delirious wounded pilot, Lieutenant Robert Campbell, who thrashed and screamed beside him. The wind tore through the shattered window, filling the cockpit with a freezing howl. Blood streaked across the flight instruments. The oxygen system had failed. Frost formed on every surface. The air temperature outside was below 40 degrees Celsius. Morgan's breath came in short gasps through a half-frozen mask. His right glove was stiff with blood. Not his own, but Campbell's. The pilot's wound had not stopped bleeding. The smell of iron, oil, and burnt insulation hung in the air. He couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the next second. Every time Campbell stirred, Morgan had to fight him again, muscles trembling, sweat freezing on his brow. And yet somehow, Ruthie II stayed aloft, a crippled fortress, held together by sheer will. Down in the radio room, Sergeant Larkins, the radio operator, had realized something was wrong. The intercom to the cockpit had gone dead after the first hit. They could hear only the hollow static of the line. When the navigator crawled forward through the narrow passage, he found the front compartment filled with smoke and frost. The co-pilot's side window was gone. He could see Morgan at the controls, his face pale, lips blue, eyes fixed ahead. But what froze him was the sight of Campbell. Slumped in his seat, blood-soaked, still struggling weakly against Morgan's grip. The navigator shouted something. No response. The wind drowned everything. He tried to crawl closer, but Morgan waved him back sharply. One motion, firm, unmistakable. Stay away. The message was clear. He had it under control, or at least he had to. The navigator returned, shaken. He told the others, "Campbell's hit bad. Morgan's flying her alone." No one spoke for a while. They all understood what that meant. At 25,000 feet, flying solo was suicide. But Morgan wasn't just flying solo. He was flying and restraining another man at the same time. The formation was thinning. Enemy fighters were still shadowing them, waiting for stragglers. The Luftwaffe had learned patience. They picked off the weak one by one. Soon, Ruthie II began to drift. The left wing was damaged. Engine number 2 was running rough, coughing black smoke. Morgan tried to correct it, but his control was limited. The bomber started to lag behind. In the tail, the gunner called over the intercom, "Fighters coming in, 6 o'clock." Morgan couldn't respond. He heard the rattle of 50 caliber guns, the thump of flak shells bursting nearby. The aircraft shuddered under impacts, metal splinters slicing through the fuselage. "Tail guns jammed," someone shouted. Then, "Waist gunner down." Morgan's world narrowed to the feel of the controls. He kept the bomber level, fingers numb, arms trembling. If he slipped, even once, they would all die. He didn't see the German fighters diving toward them, but he could feel the hits. Every burst felt like the heartbeat of the plane itself. Stronger, faster, until it seemed ready to tear apart. Inside his headset, faint voices from other bombers crackled through. "Ruthie II, you're falling out of position. What's going on up there?" "Ruthie II, close-up formation," Morgan tried to reply. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. The mic was frozen solid. He couldn't move his hand to switch frequencies anyway. The voices faded. He was alone now. The sky outside was empty. Only the echo of gunfire and the dark, distant smears of smoke marking where other planes had fallen. By the time Ruthie II reached the Dutch coast, the situation was desperate. The engines were running on fumes. Fuel leaks streaked the wings. Most of the instruments were shattered or unreadable. The navigator crawled forward again, shouting over the wind, "We're losing altitude. We have to lighten her. We won't make it across the channel." Morgan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was a blur of exhaustion and instinct. Every muscle in his right arm burned. His left hand had long gone numb, but he could still feel Campbell's twitching beside him, the weight of another man's madness pulling him toward disaster. He thought briefly about bailing out. The parachutes were ready. The rest of the crew could jump, maybe survive. But if he left the controls, even for a second, the plane would roll, spin, and tear itself apart before anyone got clear. That was the unspoken truth of his situation. He could save himself. Or he could save them. But not both. And so, he stayed. When they finally crossed into the gray light of the North Sea, the other crewmen knew what they had to do. They jettisoned everything. Guns, ammunition, empty casings, anything that could buy them altitude. Morgan still hadn't moved. His body was stiff, his face ghostly pale. Frost rimed his eyebrows. His oxygen mask had cracked, but he refused to take it off. The crew crowded behind the cockpit, shouting through the roar, "John, we're almost there. Just a few more minutes." He nodded faintly. Then the engine coughed again, one final sputter before dying. The propeller windmilled to a stop. Ruthie II began to descend. Below them, through the cloud cover, appeared the coast of England. Home. Salvation. Morgan forced his eyes to focus. He was so close, but not safe yet. The controls were sluggish, barely responding. The bomber was losing altitude fast. He couldn't let go to adjust the throttle. In the seat beside him, Campbell's breathing had slowed. His strength was gone. At last, mercifully, he slumped into unconsciousness. Morgan exhaled, a sound half sob, half breath. He finally had both hands free. He trimmed the aircraft, eased the power, and turned toward the nearest airfield. Minutes later, Ruthie II emerged from the low clouds over RAF Falsham, her landing gear half extended, one engine smoking. Ground crews ran to the field, staring up at the crippled silhouette. The bomber touched down hard, bouncing once, then skidding down the runway. Tires burst, metal screeched, but somehow, impossibly, she stopped. The cockpit door opened. Smoke poured out. Morgan was still sitting in the pilot's seat, frozen in place, his hands locked on the yoke. His uniform was soaked with blood, his eyes glassy from exhaustion. When the medics reached him, they had to pry his fingers loose. He had been holding on for over 5 hours. That night, when the ground crew inspected Ruthie II, they found more than 350 holes in her fuselage, 2 engines destroyed, 1 propeller twisted, the oxygen system gone, but 9 men were alive, because 1 refused to let go. They had to carry him out of the cockpit. Lieutenant John C. Morgan didn't walk away from that plane. He was lifted. His boots dragged across the tarmac, his head lolled to one side. The blood that had dried black on his face cracked as medics tried to wipe it away. The moment his hands were pried from the controls, his body finally surrendered. Not to enemy fire, but to exhaustion. He had flown for 5.5 hours, through flak, fire, and cold so deep it froze tears before they fell. The crew stood around him, silent. No one cheered, no one spoke. They were all alive, yes, but they were looking at a man who had seen the edge of something too big to name. When the medics cut open his flight glove, they found his right hand locked in a claw shape. It took nearly 10 minutes to force it open. The muscles had frozen into position, a physical echo of his willpower, still gripping the yoke even when consciousness was slipping away. They said later that Morgan didn't speak for several hours. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Is the crew all right?" That was all he wanted to know. That night, in the field hospital near RAF Falsham, the room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the low hum of generators outside. Morgan sat upright on the bed, his left arm in a sling, his right hand bandaged. The doctors wanted to sedate him, but he refused. The faces of his crew haunted him, the waist gunner, the tail gunner, the radio operator, men who had looked to him for something beyond orders. He kept seeing the co-pilot's face. Campbell, pale and twisted in pain. Morgan had fought to restrain him for hours, even as his own shoulder burned. He'd known, deep down, that if he'd let go, Campbell might have killed them all. But knowing that didn't make it easier. He whispered to himself. He was scared. Just scared. That word, scared, rolled through his head like a confession. Because truthfully, he'd been scared too. Every second. The legend people would later tell, the Medal of Honor, the hero pilot who saved his crew, would leave that part out. But inside the hospital, under the cold fluorescent lights, there was no legend. Just a man who had faced terror and held it in his hands. 2 days later, the commanding officer visited. A tall man with silver hair, crisp uniform, and the calm detachment of someone used to bad news. He stood at the foot of Morgan's bed, clipboard in hand. "Lieutenant Morgan," he began, "your actions were extraordinary. Frankly, beyond expectation. I've never read a report like this one." Morgan didn't answer. He looked down at his bandaged hands. "The crew owes you their lives," the officer continued. "Command will be recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross, possibly higher." Still no response. Finally, the officer asked, "Lieutenant, why didn't you bail out? Everyone says you had plenty of chances." Morgan looked up, eyes hollow but steady. "Because if I did, there wouldn't be anyone left to tell the story." The officer nodded slowly. He understood, at least as much as anyone could. But to Morgan, it wasn't heroism. It wasn't even duty. It was something simpler and harder. He had been given a choice between himself and his crew, and in the chaos of that sky, the thought of leaving them behind felt worse than death. The weeks that followed were a blur of debriefings and silence. The Air Force grounded him for medical recovery. Though he protested, his arm healed. His mind did not. He dreamed of the cockpit, the rattling, the screaming engines, the dead weight of the co-pilot beside him. In the dreams, he always let go, and in those dreams, the plane always fell. One night, another pilot found him sitting alone by the runway, watching the dark shapes of departing bombers vanish into the clouds. The man offered him a cigarette. "You ever think about how many don't come back?" he asked. Morgan exhaled smoke, eyes distant. "Every time I breathe," he said. They sat there for a long while, two silhouettes against the glow of the airfield, the sound of propellers fading into night. When the news reached the States months later, B-17 pilot saves entire crew after 5-hour solo flight, Morgan's name became legend. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for valor. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, in keeping his crippled bomber in flight despite grievous injury and overwhelming adversity." Reporters called him the Iron Pilot. But Morgan hated the interviews. He didn't like to talk about what happened. When pressed, he'd only say, "I did what any man would have done." Of course, most men wouldn't have. That's what made it a legend. In private, Morgan carried the memory like a scar, invisible, but deep. He flew again later in the war, commanding other bombers, leading missions over France and Germany. But something in him had changed. He became quieter, slower to smile. Men said he had the 1,000-yard stare, that look pilots got when they'd seen too much sky and too many friends vanish into it. Yet, when asked if he regretted staying with Ruthie II that day, his answer was always the same. "No. I made it home with my crew. That's all that mattered." Years later, after the war, when Morgan was older and the noise of engines was long behind him, a young reporter asked him if he ever thought about that mission, the one that made him famous. He chuckled softly, his voice gravelly with age. "Every now and then," he said. "Mostly when I can't sleep." The reporter smiled. "You must have been very brave." Morgan shook his head. "No. I was just too damn stubborn to let go." He paused then, his eyes drifting toward the horizon, as if seeing once more the endless sky over Hanover. The smoke, the cold, the sound of the engines dying, and the weight of a man's life in his hands. "That plane," he said quietly. "She didn't want to die. Neither did we." When history looks back on the Second World War, it often gazes down from above, from the altitude of bombers and contrails, from the endless hum of engines that defined a new kind of warfare. The war had shifted. The soldier's trench was now a cockpit. The battlefield stretched not across miles of mud, but thousands of feet of air, and men like John C. Morgan became its unlikely infantry, the warriors of the sky. The story of Ruthie II was not just a story of one man's endurance. It was a story of an entire generation of flyers who fought not only the enemy, but the machine itself. The cold, the malfunctions, the fear, and the relentless mathematics of survival. The U.S. 8th Air Force, to which Morgan belonged, was losing men at rates that would have broken most armies. During the height of 1943, the average bomber crew had a 1 in 4 chance of completing a 25-mission tour. That meant that for every 4 crews who took off in the morning, 1 would not return by nightfall. And yet they kept flying. The Air Force called it daylight precision bombing, a clinical phrase that hid the reality of what those missions were. Hours of being hunted in open skies, without fighter escort, while watching other planes explode beside you. Morgan's flight stood as an embodiment of that reality, of the fragile line between human will and mechanical failure, between courage and chaos. Historians later called the 8th Air Force the Bloody 100th. They were the spear point of the air war over Europe, the men who struck at the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and aircraft factories that kept Hitler's war machine alive. But every strategic triumph came with a human price. Every bomb dropped meant another story like Morgan's, another crew clawing its way back across the channel, praying the engines would hold. The arithmetic of air war was brutal. Each B-17 carried 10 men. Each loss was 10 lives. Each mission risked hundreds of bombers. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force alone had lost over 26,000 airmen, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. It was, in many ways, the most dangerous job of the war. Morgan's act of holding on to Ruthie II through sheer will became a living symbol of the resilience that powered that entire campaign. Military theorists studying the mission later pointed to it as an example of human override, the phenomenon in which instinct and discipline push a person beyond rational limits, maintaining control where machines and training both fail. In the age of machines, Morgan had proved something unexpected. That courage still mattered, because in the cockpit of that crippled bomber, the limits of technology had already been reached. No manual could tell a man how to fly with one hand while restraining a dying co-pilot. No flight procedure could dictate what to do when every system failed and the sky turned into a killing ground. Only the human element, that unpredictable spark of defiance, could carry them home. In the aftermath of the war, the world's militaries drew their lessons. The Allies' strategic bombing campaign broke Germany's industrial capacity, crippling its fuel supply and aircraft production, but at a cost that scarred an entire generation of airmen. Even as radar and jet propulsion ushered in a new era, the story of men like Morgan became moral anchors, proof that technology could never replace judgment, or the quiet stubbornness that made survival possible. The Air Force Academy would later teach his story in leadership courses, not for its tactical content, but for its ethical one. Because what Morgan did was not just an act of endurance, it was an act of choice. He chose to stay. He chose responsibility over safety, duty over instinct. And that decision, made not in calm but in chaos, was what transformed him from a pilot into a symbol. The British, who shared the same skies, understood that symbolism well. The RAF called it airmanship, the ability to stay composed when everything falls apart. To the Americans, it was something even simpler. They called it grit. Morgan's mission became a parable of grit, the idea that heroism was not loud or glorious, but quiet, grinding, and relentless. The act of refusing to give up when every sane impulse says you should. Years after the war, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of the RAF Bomber Command, was asked about the moral cost of strategic bombing. The cities destroyed, the civilians killed. He replied coldly, "War is a terrible thing, but in the end, it is courage that decides who survives it." That courage in all its forms was what kept men like Morgan in the air. They were not philosophers or strategists. They were mechanics of survival, holding 1,000 tons of metal in balance while the world collapsed around them. And in doing so, they revealed something profound. That even in an age of industrial warfare, the smallest human decisions, a grip on the yoke, a refusal to bail, could still alter history. When the Air Force Museum restored a B-17 decades later, they placed a small plaque near the cockpit. It read, "Dedicated to Lieutenant John C. Red Morgan, who refused to let go." Visitors would step inside and run their hands along the cold metal, tracing the same controls he once held. The seat was cramped, the instruments primitive. For many, it was hard to imagine anyone surviving even an hour in such conditions, let alone 5. But that was the essence of the bomber war, endurance through impossibility. Morgan's legacy was not just the Medal of Honor or the mission reports that filled the archives. It was the mindset that carried across generations of pilots, from B-17s to B-52s, from bombers to spacecraft. Every time a pilot sits in a cockpit and trusts their life to a machine, they inherit a little of what Morgan carried that day over Hanover. The belief that holding on can still make the difference between life and death, victory and loss, return and oblivion. By the end of the war, air power had proven itself decisive. Cities fell not by armies, but by shadows, the shadows of aircraft overhead. But beneath those shadows, there were always men, hands trembling, hearts racing, eyes staring into endless sky, who made impossible choices. And among them, John Morgan's choice still stands apart. He didn't just defy the enemy, he defied the machine. And in that defiance, he reminded the world that even in the cold, mechanical theater of modern war, the human soul was still the most powerful weapon of all. The war ended, but for men like John Morgan, the silence that followed was almost harder to bear than the sound of engines. When Ruthie II finally limped back to England that day in 1943, the ground crews rushed forward, expecting wreckage, not survivors. They found a cockpit soaked in blood, instruments shattered, oxygen masks frozen stiff from altitude frost. And at the controls, a man whose right arm was so locked from tension it had to be pried from the yoke. Morgan had flown for nearly 5 hours in that position, through flak, fighters, and the full weight of gravity itself. The crew lived because he refused to let go. But courage always leaves a mark. In the days after the mission, Morgan barely spoke. Doctors treated him for exhaustion, frostbite, and shock. But the greater wounds, the ones that hid behind his calm, distant stare, were harder to reach. Every man who survived the bomber war carried something invisible home with him. The sound of engines that never stopped echoing, the smell of burning oil that lingered in their dreams, the faces of those who didn't make it back. When Morgan was awarded the Medal of Honor, the ceremony was brief. He stood in his pressed uniform, hat tucked under his arm, surrounded by brass and flashbulbs. The citation was read aloud, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty. But Morgan looked straight ahead, expression steady, almost detached. He accepted the medal not as glory, but as a burden. After the applause faded, he said quietly to a friend, "I only did what I had to do. Any one of them would have done the same." And in those words lay the quiet truth of an entire generation. For the rest of the war, Morgan continued to fly. He could have been grounded, could have gone home a hero, but he went back up, again and again, into the same skies that nearly killed him. Each mission was a return to the past. Each takeoff was a question. How many more times can I tempt fate? He survived the war, but part of him never came down. When peace finally arrived in 1945, the airfields emptied. The runways that once shook under the weight of B-17s fell silent. Grass grew through the cracks. The hangars became warehouses. The skies, once filled with contrails, turned blue again. For the first time in years, no one was shooting at anyone. Yet for many of the airmen, silence was its own kind of noise. It was in that quiet that the memories came back. Not the missions themselves, but the small human details. The smell of coffee before dawn. The cold metal of the fuselage against bare hands. The voices over the radio, laughing, joking, pretending not to be afraid. Those details were what they missed most, not the war, but the brotherhood it forged. In the decades that followed, Morgan rarely spoke publicly about what happened over Hanover. He lived quietly, away from cameras and ceremonies. Friends said he never bragged, never exaggerated. To him, the Medal of Honor wasn't a symbol of triumph. It was a reminder of the men who didn't make it home. He carried that humility like a second uniform. When asked once by a young pilot what the hardest part of that day had been, Morgan paused for a long moment. Then he said, "The hardest part was knowing that the man sitting next to me was dying, and I couldn't help him." That was the truth behind the legend, the part no medal could capture. History books later listed the mission in precise military terms. July 28, 1943, B-17, Ruthie II, target, Hanover. Result, aircraft returned safely. Crew survived, pilot awarded Medal of Honor. But the real story, the human story, lived on only in the memories of those who understood what it meant to hold on to life at 25,000 feet. For every Morgan, there were hundreds of others, nameless, faceless, swallowed by the sky. Some burned, some vanished into clouds, some made it home but never truly returned. And that is the unspoken aftermath of war. Victory may end the fighting, but it never ends the remembering. Today, if you walk through the quiet halls of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can find Morgan's Medal of Honor encased in glass. It glints faintly under the lights, gold against dark velvet. Beside it, there's a photograph of a young man in his 20s, smiling, unaware of the weight of history waiting above him. Visitors pass by, some slowing down, reading the inscription. Most move on. But for those who stop long enough, the silence around that medal says everything words cannot. It says that courage isn't noise or glory. It's endurance. It's restraint. It's the act of holding the line, even when no one will ever know. When night falls over the museum, the lights dim. The glass reflects the faint outlines of other medals, other names, and somewhere, in that stillness, you can almost hear it. The distant hum of 4 engines climbing into the dark, carrying 10 men who believed they could make it back. Some did. Some didn't. But all of them, for a few fragile hours, held the sky. When the war finally faded into memory and the last bombers were scrapped for metal, the skies above Europe grew quiet again. But some sounds never leave the world. They just change form. The echo of engines becomes the whisper of history, and the hands that once gripped a trembling yoke still reach out, through time, asking us to remember. John Morgan died in 1991. No parades, no headlines, just a quiet passing of a man who once held the weight of 9 other lives in his hands. At his funeral, a few surviving airmen stood by his grave. The wind rustled through the flags, and one of them, gray-haired, eyes hidden behind dark glasses, said softly, "He wasn't a hero because of what he did. He was a hero because he stayed." There was no reply, only the sound of wind moving through the cemetery and the faint echo of a B-17 engine that wasn't really there. History often writes in grand strokes, battles, dates, victories. But the truth of war lies in the small, fragile details. A hand that won't let go of the controls. A dying man whose last words are lost in the static of a radio. A crew who never knew if they'd live another hour. Morgan's story is not about triumph. It's about endurance. It's about what happens when courage outlasts hope, and yet still chooses to hold on. Every generation tries to make sense of war, to define it, rationalize it, learn from it. But the real lessons are never written in strategy books. They are found in the faces of those who carried its weight. In Morgan's silence. In the mechanic who kept patching wings that would soon be riddled again. In the nurse who waited beside a runway for planes that never landed. In all the forgotten names, the quiet architects of survival. War, in the end, is not made of victory or defeat. It is made of choices, small, human choices, that reveal who we are when the world is falling apart. When you watch the old film reels, the black and white bombers droning over gray clouds, look closer. Somewhere in one of those planes sits a young man, sweat frozen on his face, flying through flak and fear, holding a line that no one else will see. He doesn't know if he'll survive the hour. He doesn't know if history will remember his name. But still, he stays at the controls. And that is the real story of war. Not the glory, not the medals, not the flags, but the heartbeat that refuses to stop even when everything else does. John Morgan's B-17 has long since vanished, melted into the earth or sea. But the spirit that held it together that day, that quiet defiance, still lives in the sky. In every pilot who takes off into uncertain weather. In every soldier who refuses to leave a comrade behind. In every act of endurance that asks for no reward, no recognition, only remembrance. because remembrance is what turns a story into legacy. And when the last veterans are gone and the airfields are overgrown with grass, perhaps the wind that crosses them will still carry a faint sound, not of sorrow, but of memory, the hum of engines, the rhythm of courage, the echo of a man who refused to let go. And in that silence that follows, the world once again will remember what it cost to stay alive.